Mask mandates are back. Are lockdowns coming back? And can that ever be justified when Sweden's no lockdown stance appears to have been verified? Would it have been better all along if we'd done nothing? Hello there, you 6.5 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom that will involve new alliances, new conversations, and staying awake, staying aware, and not succumbing to the cultural amnesia of, oh yeah, they did say that 6 months ago, didn't they? Stay awake, baby. Stay awake. And let me know in the comments if you've noticed this tendency towards just forgetting stuff and not asking questions about what happened 6 months ago and what was assumed about e.g. lab leak theory versus wet market. Today, though, we're talking about the return of mask mandates, Trump's new perspective on vaccines and lockdowns, and Sweden. Did Sweden get it right all along by being non-interventionist? Now, we can't revise the past, but we do have to remember it. We do have to learn from it. Now, Donald Trump, and I know a lot of you guys love him, was very proud of those vaccines, right? That's probably one of the things you're like, oh, but he does like the vaccine. Well, let's see what Donald Trump is saying about the vaccines, lockdowns, and potential pandemic policies going forward.
The left-wing lunatics are trying very hard to bring back COVID lockdowns and mandates with all of their sudden fear-mongering about the new variants that are coming. Gee whiz, you know what else is coming? An election. They want to restart the COVID hysteria so they can justify more lockdowns, more censorship.
I do believe in the general analysis that first there is an appetite to achieve something, and then they reverse engineer the way to achieve it. The legacy media is falling apart. The ability to control the narrative and control the people is starting to change. The suggestion is we need new systems and new models. There should be more democracy, not less, less authority, not more. And Donald Trump, whether or not he delivers, and you can let me know in the comments what you think about this, he knows the language, he knows the rhetoric, he knows the questions, he knows how to frame these arguments. And because what we're offered as an alternative to Donald Trump is such inept, innocuous, vacuous, deceptive politics, people claiming that there's a new pharma bill, you look at the details, it's bullshit. The Hawaii fires, well, let's look after our own, we care about diverse people, it's bullshit. Because of that, this kind of language, this kind of rhetoric is much more powerful. And because we were all, generally speaking, so compliant in the lockdown era, and then you learn Sweden, who basically said, oh, go about your business, we'll work it out, we're trying to cross-reference it with the economic impact of lockdowns, the impact on cancer, heart disease, diabetes, medical health, addiction. We're looking at it and we're thinking probably a non-interventionist approach. Plus, we're a genuinely liberal democracy who don't secretly crave as much authoritarianism as possible. Because of that, they had a different approach to the pandemic. Now we can see the results. Stay awake, stay aware, keep educating yourself, and remember events of just 6 months ago. Then you'll be better equipped to have conversations. That's what we're trying to do. Arm you with the facts so that when they come to you with the next pack of lies and pack of suggestions that are going to impede your freedom and curiously not affect the globalist corporate state, you can say, but what about last time? You said X and Y turned out to be true. Let's have a look at those X's and Y's. And maybe the why nots.
We will not shut down our schools. We will not accept your lockdowns. We will not abide by your mask mandates. And we will not tolerate your vaccine mandates. They rigged the 2020 election, and now they're trying to do the same thing all over again by rigging the most important election in the history of our country, the 2024 election, even if it means trying to bring back COVID. But they will fail because we will not let it happen. When I'm back in the White House, I will use every available authority to cut federal funding to any school, college, airline, or public transportation system that imposes a mask mandate or a vaccine mandate. Thank you very much.
So I suppose the conversation has radically changed because Donald Trump, at the height of the pandemic, of course, declared that the vaccines were a tremendous success, and he was in a different position then, and there was different information available now. But let's just take the temperature of our current moment. Donald Trump has assessed the situation and has decided, wow, it's now going to be more effective to say, in government, I would make mask mandates illegal or I'd do anything within my power to prevent them, rather than, we have to deal with this pandemic. So that's a significant change. Now, stay with us to the very end. Firstly, what we're going to assess is what's being proposed right now, and then we're going to look at the results of what happened in Sweden. And hopefully this is okay to discuss on the YouTube platform, because of course the WHO guidelines are what determine the community guidelines on YouTube, which amount to their ability to censor this type of information. Let me know in the comments if our videos are still appearing in your feeds, for example. Despite very low numbers of people with serious illness, a recent rise in COVID cases has led to a return of mask mandates in a number of institutions. In Hollywood, the movie studio Lionsgate issued a requirement for masks, as have several several colleges and universities, along with hospital systems in California and New York. Some medical and health professionals have even demanded a return of mask mandates in schools. So is it a health issue or is it a political issue? Was it ever a health issue? Was it always a political issue? Now, at the very beginning, I think we were all scared and concerned and it was an entirely novel thing, but the conversations about the measures began pretty swiftly, didn't they? And it became politicized and divisive rather than unifying pretty quickly. Let me know at this point, is the pandemic or any potential variant of it a political or health issue? Let me know below. The return of required face coverings, of course, echoes official masking guidance and policies that were enacted in many contexts from spring 2020 through early 2022. Universal masking was part of a broader pandemic response beyond vaccinations that was based on mandatory non-pharmaceutical interventions that also included quarantining healthy people who were potentially exposed to an infected person, banning gatherings of healthy people in churches and other locations, and long-term preemptive closures of schools and businesses. It will be very difficult for those in power not to conclude from the events of 2019 to 2022 that if required, you can control people, you can control people's behavior, you can massively influence their spending habits, their eating habits, their social habits, their habits of worship, their most enshrined values can be altered by government edicts. I don't think they've ignored that information, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw attempts to utilize that knowledge, if not through coronavirus pandemics where there is obvious and explicit resistance in various forms, including us here on this channel, I would have to say, through wars, through climate, significant, important issues that have to be addressed, but I would contest in ways that affect powerful institutions, not ordinary people. Let me know in the comments if you agree with that. Mask mandates and these other interventions were and are premised on a basic idea. A large proportion of healthy people may unknowingly be infected with COVID and could transmit the virus to others. The results from a unique new study, however, call this logic into question. The paper published in the August issue of the journal The Lancet Microbe found that infected people pre-symptomatically, that is before they develop symptoms, very rarely had the ability to infect others. Have you heard that information before? I am not claiming that it's entirely true. I'm asking if you have seen those studies. Let me know in the comments. What this means is that compelling people without COVID symptoms to wear masks in any number of environments, including most controversially schools, along with quarantining healthy people, closing schools and other social distancing measures, likely yielded far, far less societal benefit than we're told. If something doesn't have a rational scientific basis, its qualities are essentially apotropaic, a good luck charm. Have that word. Let's see what Fauci, who advocated for masks more strongly than anybody, even though he privately expressed doubts about their efficacy numerous times, that's a matter of record. Let's see what he's saying about this new data.
Brett Stevens in The Times talked about Cochrane. Put that on the screen.
As a side note, watch how many times this bloke intensely stares and let me know if that would freak you out if you were chatting to him, or worse.
The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference, he told the journalist Mayan Damasi, full stop. But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said.
Bloody hell, New York Times and CNN took their time, didn't they? I remember when it was all watch out for the horse paste and shame the unvaccinated. Seems like, get to near on 2024. Oh, it's time to talk about the truth. Must be another hustle coming. Can you imagine how hard it is for us to go to Pfizer after a thing like this and say, give some money, will you? We'll advertise Pfizer. It's impossible. Can you imagine the challenges we have that the legacy media don't have? We care about you, we care about truth, but we got to keep this movement running. That's why we have commercial partners like these. Support them if you can, and I'll try and make the advert funny by being silly throughout it, even though I respect our commercial partners. Yeah, thanks, Klaus. Yeah, I'll own nothing and I'll be happy. Thank you. Hey, have you ever heard of a data broker? Of course you haven't, because the mainstream media won't tell you about them. They're the middlemen collecting and selling all those digital footprints you leave online. They can stitch together detailed profiles which includes your browsing history, online searches, and location data. The data broker then sells your profile off to a company who delivers you a really targeted ad. Well, you might be surprised to learn that these same data brokers are also selling your information to the Department of Homeland Security and the IRS. ExpressVPN. When you're connected to ExpressVPN, your IP address is hidden. They don't know nothing about it. That makes it much more difficult for data brokers to identify who you are. You are mysterious now. All I do is tap one little button, turn it on, and I'm protected. It's that easy. I've organised this for you myself. I've got a bit of clout over at ExpressVPN. Look, just tell them Russ sent you. You'll get 3 months extra through my special link, expressvpn.com/brand, to learn more and finally be safe from the bloody system. Now, let me just get back on the phone with Klaus. Yeah, no, I've done it, mate. It went quite well, I think.
Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies. How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
Now, he's already starting with the staring. He's trying to stare into Anthony Fauci's innermost thoughts. And really what we all want to hear from Anthony Fauci is, why did you advocate so strongly for mask mandates when you yourself questioned them? Why did you query the lab leak theory when you yourself thought it was plausible? Why did you promote the wet market theory so aggressively? Because some people thought that might be because that would lead to the conclusion that science itself had generated this problem and therefore should clear up the mess, and that there were financial ties between the world. There's so many bloody questions, and you know all of them. Let me know if there's any I've missed below. But have a look at how Anthony Fauci obfuscates and prevaricates in order to avoid telling us the simple truth. I was wrong. I was wrong about that, and it's unfortunate I make so much money.
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual, when you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole.
That's so extraordinary, isn't it? Because a pandemic and an epidemic by its nature is about populations. Start saying, yeah, but as an individual. Well, if it's for individuals, maybe don't mandate it. Maybe have a individual choice or liberty or freedom. It's almost as if there's an appetite to curtail and control individual freedom. That's the starting point. And then ways to legitimize controlling individual freedom are introduced. Even if they're seemingly insignificant things like, would you mind wearing this mask? Or would you mind standing 2 meters away? Two examples which increasingly, under scientific scrutiny, are looking to be arbitrary, ineffective. And that means that the recommendations, and in some cases mandates, were untrue.
When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong.
Do you see the true expertise of Anthony Fauci? Do you remember when he used to say, I am science? Now what we have to say is he's just a skilled prevaricator and communicator. The science over populations is less strong is another way of saying that isn't true at all. Less strong sounds better, doesn't it? Because you've got the word strong in it. Almost like, oh, it's sort of right and it's sort of okay. When really what this dude should be saying right now on the news, if he had any integrity at all, is, I was completely wrong about that. But then you wouldn't have the ability to censor people. Then you wouldn't have the ability to control people. Do you see how this works now? Because I'm beginning to.
When you took at the broad population level, like the Cochrane study, the data are less firm.
Oh, it's less strong, less firm, not there at all.
With regard to the effect on the overall pandemic.
This being 2023 and all, we now have a pretty significant study. Sweden had an entirely different approach to the pandemic based on looking at the various factors, economics, other diseases, mental health issues, etc. Let's have a look. The reigning narrative of Sweden during the pandemic is that the Swedish government took a brazenly hands-off approach to COVID-19 and suffered mass avoidable deaths as a result. During the spring and summer of 2020, Sweden bucked the international trend by not issuing emergency stay-at-home orders, mask mandates, or school closures. With the exception of restrictions on nursing home visits and large gatherings, the country stayed open during that time. The concurrent spike in COVID deaths it experienced, particularly in comparisons to its Scandinavian peers, was all the proof politicians and much of the press needed to dismiss its liberal, there's a word that used to mean something, approach as inferior to Chinese-inspired lockdowns that swept the rest of the globe. Chinese, those are the guys to emulate when it comes to democracy. The New York Times called the country a cautionary tale. Well, that turned out to be peculiarly perspicacious, because here's the caution: don't trust the government, don't trust the legacy media, trust yourselves, trust independent media. Then President Donald Trump denounced the country's approach on Twitter. Trump, like most of the establishment, favoured coercive measures early on. On April the 30th, 2020, Trump tweeted, Sweden is paying heavily for its decision not to lock down. Yet this interpretation of Sweden's COVID-19 performance as disastrous and deadly is largely wrong, argues Johan Norberg in a new paper for the Cato Institute. The data that's accumulated over the past 3 3 years suggests that Sweden's laissez-faire approach seems to have paid off, writes Norberg. It seems likely that Sweden did much better than other countries in terms of the economy, education, mental health, and domestic abuse, and still came away from the pandemic with fewer excess deaths than in almost any other European country, and less than half that of the United States. So all of those other factors, as well as less excessive deaths. Well, what does that point to? That's extraordinary. So now you have to look at the motivations, but unless Sweden is the land of the geniuses, and I thought their greatest achievements were the Volvo, the sauna, and ABBA, but we can now add to that freedom, liberty, common sense, which I think were ABBA's names. No, it's Benny, I think. I don't know. Sweden has largely been dismissed as a failure on COVID-19 because its COVID death rate was middle of the back of the list when compared to other European countries and much higher than other Scandinavian countries that had harsher restrictions. Sweden did get hit harder earlier in the pandemic, and it's on this earlier performance that much of the commentary about the country's pandemic failures came from. That snapshot is misleading. Well, of course it's misleading. That's what the mainstream media do. Sweden's comparatively dismal performance at the start of the pandemic was mostly a result of other countries having managed to delay cases and deaths rather than having prevented them, writes Johan Norberg. Sweden suffered most of its deaths in 2020, while the Nordic neighbours and many other countries got them in 2022. The Cato Papers cites one Norwegian public health official as saying, other countries managed to delay some deaths, but now 3 years after, we end up at around the same place. My God. So you have to think about it. Was it worth it? Let me know in the comments what kind of outcome would you have preferred, particularly if you're watching this in America, and I know the majority of you are. Would you have preferred a Swedish approach? Let me know in the comments below. Norberg's paper repeats a common practical argument against lockdowns, that they're unnecessary because people will voluntarily restrict their interactions with others in response to rising risk of the virus. You as an individual are capable of making decisions yourself. Can you see how ontologically profound, how ideological it becomes at its genesis? When you look at it at the truly molecular level, you are making a case for freedom. You're making a case for what is your relationship with your government? Who does your government work for? How is your government funded? What kind of decisions does your government make? Does it seem like your government loves you and cares for you based on their actions historically and even currently? Are they telling you the truth right now about a whole host of issues? Bearing all that in mind, who do you want making decisions for yourself and your family? You or them? But people adapt voluntarily when they realise that lives are at stake. Swedes quickly changed their behaviour and mostly followed the recommendations, writes Norberg, citing data showing a rise in remote work arrangements and a collapse in public transit ridership early in the pandemic. So, in a sense, what we're discussing is the role of government, the nature of government. Obviously, America and countries like mine and other Anglophonic and Western nations assume, no, people are stupid. People have to be controlled. You can't say to people, you voted us in to help you guys out, right, and to run your institutions and agencies. Look, here's some of the data, here's a variety of opinions. We're advocating for staying at home, particularly if you're at risk or you spend time with people that are at risk, and we'll keep you informed, but we're going to leave it to you guys. That actually sounds like the type of government I want. Let me know in the comments if that's what you want and if you think we should move in that direction. Particularly when authoritarianism is so often wrong. He suggests that the reliance on voluntary compliance meant Swedes were more willing to comply with pandemic precautions for longer. Mandatory COVID restrictions in other countries bred backlash to any countermeasures, leading to a greater number of deaths later on. Perhaps that's true, but if it is, it doesn't seem any of it made much difference in the deadliness of the pandemic. Again, Sweden ended up in basically the same place in terms of overall mortality as its Nordic peers, and in a much better place than many other rich countries. Tell me if at the time you were saying, but how's this going to affect the economy? How's this going to affect community? How's it going to affect our children's learning ability? How's it going to affect diabetes, cancer, mental health, addiction? You can add to that list, I'm sure, ad infinitum. Add to that list below. Swedish students suffered no learning loss during the pandemic, whereas half of US students did. The country's economic growth outperformed the Eurozone and the United States. It avoided other countries' increased suicide rates and deteriorated mental health. All things that could have been prevented, all things that were discussed at the time. This is not a 2020 hindsight situation. To be sure, Sweden's COVID-19 policies weren't completely anarchic. Some of the restrictions the country adopted during the winter of 2020 and spring and summer of 2021 were comparable or even stricter than what many US states had in place. The country was nevertheless much more respectful of people's individual choices during the pandemic than other European countries and most US states. That additional freedom doesn't appear to have proven more deadly in the aggregate. Instead, it seems to have helped Sweden avoid many of the asocial knock-on effects of banning or restricting public life for months or years at a time. There you have it. An entirely different perspective, an entirely different approach, one one that seems based on the principles that we hear discussed so often: freedom, liberty, compassion, kindness, people being able to make their own decisions for themselves and their community. An admission from Anthony Fauci that mask mandates don't work across a population. They're a decision that should be left to an individual. Do you sense that a theme is developing? Individual freedom, localized democracies, less centralized authority, stop subsidizing and funding media organizations and big pharma companies that seem to benefit from lying to you and backing the government in their desire to control you. To me, Sweden's approach makes a lot more sense. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. Turn on the notification bell and subscribe. There's a few tickets left of my UK shows, intimate shows talking about democracy and stuff. Come along if you fancy it. There's a link in the description down there. More important than any of that stuff, though, is that you please, if you can, stay free.